So there's some news, and I thought I would get the panel back together. Welcome to the panel. Garry, Marci, Allison. Um, who wants to go first? What the hell just happened? Marci.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. Good to be back with you. Nice to see everybody again. So what the hell just happened? Well, it's definitely a new day in America. But we have actually seen this movie before, or a variant of it. Lots of references, of course, to the original and the sequel. And generally speaking, historically, from a box office perspective, the sequels don't usually fare as well as the original. So it remains to be seen how this film turns out. But what happened last night is, I think what many people kind of felt in their guts, but maybe didn't want to believe, which is that there was a very deep anti-incumbency sentiment that we have seen play out really across the world, and certainly in this case. And if you look at the numbers, and I'm sure we will dissect numbers in different respects in different parts of the country, but the vice president did not fare as well as President Biden did in the last go round. Her margins decreased in certain places where the Democrats felt they had a hold or a stronghold. And so it's impossible, I think, to look at this any other way than a vote against the administration. Of course, she was tied to that administration. There was not much runway or lead time for her to change that narrative of being tied to Bidenomics. Clearly, given everything that transpired between the president's decision in the summer and to date, maybe the shortest presidential campaign or presidential run in history. And she was contending with that feeling from the get-go, which we knew that the Biden presidency, for better or for worse, was going to be an albatross around her neck. And I think that's really what happened last evening. I think there are some other strategic decisions that we'll get into, I suspect, over the course of this discussion, in terms of how the Democrats framed her main talking points, her closing argument, her closing debate, that focus on reproductive rights and reproductive health, which obviously played very well for the Democrats in the midterms, perhaps not as salient at this point in time, and that feeling that her central message and theme around the opportunity economy maybe took too much of a backseat to some of these other issues, and in fact, that should have been more central and more at the forefront from the get-go. But again, I think we'll talk more about that. But I think ultimately what just happened is it was an anti-administration vote, and that's where we are.
So let me redirect a bit with a hypothetical, but it's fun. Could a member of this administration have won? Biden leaves at the end of July. Uh, Somebody very close to him gets switched in at the last minute, a few weeks before the convention. Um, could somebody else, or could Harris have played it differently so that this campaign was winnable? Or is this just incumbent fatigue down the line?
I'll go quickly first on that and let
Yeah.
others weigh in. I do think incumbent fatigue, or as some of the pollsters have dubbed it, inflationitis, that inability to get over that persistent feeling that Americans continue to feel around the cost of living and their inability to get ahead, that feeling that there actually is no longer equality of opportunity in America for everyone, that feeling that some are being held back, so prevalent across all states. I think it would have been a Herculean task for any member of this administration to try to change that narrative and message track on the economy. I think even tougher for someone with this little time and space to try to create the distance that would have been necessary to do that.
Okay. Allison, before we get into sort of what the hell are we to make of this result, well, how do you explain it?
I don't know. Like, I really don't know.
Yep.
I think Marci, I think you're right on the inflation piece. We're seeing that here too, that there are a lot of factors outside of a state leader's control that are causing these inflation issues. And it's just so easy for the opposition to blame it all on the leader. So, there's an element of that. I've never seen anger over immigration and the economy amount to the election of a leader like this. It feels so weird to be picking apart Kamala Harris's strategy after seeing the last debate. I mean, this guy's strategy is saying that people are eating dogs in Ohio. So it does feel a little bit absurd that we're kind of criticizing her on her positioning. And I don't know the answer to that anymore. I mean, the other thing that, like, as a woman, I guess is kind of obvious to me is, like, what more do we have to do? Like, how much more perfect do we have to be? We've never had an elected female prime minister here. You know, still can't smash that ceiling in the United States. And a lot of people will say Clinton was a flawed candidate, and she was a flawed candidate. But to see Harris get the same numbers, I don't know how to make sense of this through things I read in my political science degree. You know, the mold is broken.
I've got some theories, but we'll hold them back for a second. Garry, you actually had expected or suspected that Trump would win. What do you make of the results?
Well, what's the old James Carville line? It's the economy, stupid. I think that was very, very, very clear from last night's result. The economy, and I think illegal immigration, which is just not our experience. Yes, we have challenges with immigration here, but we don't have the mass influx that we've had in the United States over the last, especially over the last 4 years, which is a direct comment on the Biden-Harris record. And I think the Trump people, using whatever tactics they used, and you can question a lot of the tactics, but they made that very, very clear. Look, I think let's take a step back. Let's go all the way back to, say, January of this year. It struck me that in January of this year, a lot of Democrats, senior Democrats, whisper campaigns saying Kamala Harris is a terrible vice president. She's the worst vice president we've had in living memory. She's a drag on the ticket. Maybe we have to dump her from the ticket. This isn't working. To 6 months later being, she is the savior of the party. She's going to take us to the promised land. To me, that was a disconnect right from the start of the campaign against Biden internally. How do you go 6 months from previous saying she's the worst, she's awful, to being she's the best thing since sliced bread? And I don't think the Democrats were ever able to square that circle. I don't think she ran a particularly effective campaign. I think when you have a candidate who spent most of the campaign, the time when she was the presidential campaign, not answering questions, not doing particularly well in one-on-one interview situations, it just fed fuel to the fire. And look at the results this morning. She got the same number of votes as it looks like Hillary Clinton in 2016.
Yeah.
Biden got 81 million votes in 2020. She's got so far 66 million. I mean, it's not even close. And it was interesting last night watching John King on CNN break down some of the really Democratic county strongholds. So you take a look at, Philadelphia and the areas around Philadelphia and some of the other strongholds. And in almost every one of them, Harris, when you compare 2024 to 2020, Harris was way behind or far behind where Biden was in 2020. And so you just can't make up those votes to close the gap over that time. And so I really do think this is essentially a referendum on the economy. Yes, incumbentitis it's a challenge all over the Western world. That certainly played a factor. But I think questions about the economy and illegal immigration really won out the day yesterday.
So let me share my two theories, and then you guys can pick it apart. There's a sort of a near-term thing and a long-term thing. The near-term thing is, how did Biden do better than the two women? And I think it's a perfectly valid theory that it's part of it is that they were women and that a lot of voters don't want to listen to that. I think another part of it is that Biden was talking to people who weren't necessarily inclined to celebrate the fact that he existed. Biden understood that a lot of America was hurting and a lot of America was mourning, and he was not, and that a lot of America doesn't know who the proper celebrities are or what the proper vocabulary is, and he wasn't interested in the politics of joy. He was much more interested in the politics of mourning after one of the deadliest periods in American history. And that way he was able to erode the Trump vote rather than warning people against the Trump vote. And then the other thing I can't stop thinking about, I said it in a speech I gave 10 days ago. And even when I was saying it, I didn't really think of the significance of it. The average lifespan in the United States peaked at 78.9 years in 2014 and started declining since then. Life expectancy in the United States does not decline. Life expectancy in the United States since the founding of the Republic has been increasing, with two exceptions. The Civil War made Americans die younger, and the First World War made Americans die younger. And then life expectancy started to increase again. And it stopped cold in 2010, and it started to decline in 2014. And 2 years later, Donald Trump got elected. And 5 years after that, COVID happened. And people have looked at this say, opioids had a hell of a lot to do with it, but so did alcoholism, tobacco, gun suicide. And that the places where it happened were places like the Ohio Valley, the old coal belt, and one of the epicenters of this shit is Pennsylvania. And Biden, as his ads said in 2020, was from Scranton. And the Harris campaign seemed to view Pennsylvania as a great place to go to remind you why you shouldn't vote for Donald Trump, rather than to say, I know why you voted for Donald Trump. That's my master theory of all of this. And I think a lot of people in America were not feeling listened to last night. Yeah. Am I crazy?
So I actually think you have to view, just as you have, Paul, you have to view the outcome of last night through the context of history, long-term and short-term. And we have seen a decline not only in the life expectancy, but there has been a decline in that sense of unity and, again, equality of opportunity in the United States now over multiple generations. It has not been on a trend that anybody would view as positive. I don't even know. I mean, you could go back to Ronald Reagan and sort of that beginning of that feeling of that gap between rich and poor, that feeling of a mushy middle of people being left behind in the middle. I don't want to make too many allusions or comparisons to Germany at the front end of the last century, but certainly everything that flowed from the First World War in terms of appeasement and that impact on German economy and that feeling of whether or not Germans could be included in the economy or feeling left out from the economy translated into some very difficult political outcomes, as we know, in the 1930s and into the 1940s. And unfortunately, what we are seeing in the American experience, and you've laid out some of those very tragic realities, whether it's opioids or gun violence or gun suicide, et cetera, those have been metastasizing now for maybe 40 years. Like there's kind of a golden age after, to some extent, after the Second World War. And then there has been a steady decline and erosion in terms of that feeling of togetherness, feeling of, and, I actually think quite salient in terms of Kamala Harris's use of, let's see our neighbors as our neighbors and not our opponents or our foes. The fact that that needs to be said out loud speaks volumes about that connectivity, that feeling of community, togetherness, and that we're all in it together. Even if America is a deeply individualistic society, where one needs to be pulled up by one's own bootstraps, there was at some point a commonality of perspective that we were in it together. Americans were in it together. And again, like that has been ebbed away at. And all of that, the corollary effect of that is all of the terrible things that you just outlined, which allow you to get to this moment in time where, Kamala Harris perhaps was not delivering a message of, I feel your pain. And that may come back to be the haunting lesson from this campaign for Democratic strategists. And that probably was the message that was resonant. But, in some ways in which I personally don't find appealing, but I can see Donald Trump is speaking to that cohort. And that's clearly what people wanted to hear.
Yeah. Incidentally, I rehearsed that little rant I just delivered to a friend, and they said, great. Life expectancy went down. Congratulations. Did it get better after Trump was elected? And the answer is no. It went down gently for a few years, and then it plummeted during COVID. I don't think Trump is a rational response to a lot of these things that I've just described. I don't think he's got great answers to a lot of these problems. But horrible tragedy leads people to do whatever they can to get away from it. After the, and it often leads people to fall for demagogues. After the Civil War, it wasn't a period of great coming together for an America that had found peace again. It was the Reconstruction period, which was basically canceling a lot of the things that Lincoln had tried to do to make the country better. But I think a task that faces progressives is that they should start to notice when their solutions spectacularly have not been working. I mean, spectacularly. And I think here north of the border, that's also a challenge for some progressives. Who wants another round of this, and then we'll try and figure out what this means for Canada.
Well, I'll chime in, Paul, and you laid out quite the story there, which is quite depressing in its nature, but I think there's a lot of truth to it. And who's the poster child for that? J.D. Vance. Whether you like him or not, like if you read the book Hillbilly Elegy, I've read it. It lays out the case that you've just laid out about declining life expectancy and the cause of that, and the hollowing out of the Rust Belt. It captures it just perfectly. And if you go back in time, I remember John Ibbotson writing a piece in the Globe and Mail talking about globalization and how elites in this country and elsewhere, one of the reasons why there's been a turn against it is they failed to make the case to working people. It was a rising tide lifts all boats, and I'll say, my time in government, I'm partially guilty of this too. A rising tide lifts all boats. Globalization is good for you. Free trade is good for you. And what happened? Well, a lot of people lost their jobs in Rust Belt states or in manufacturing places in Ontario. And they said, yeah, how'd that work out for me? Not so great. And look at my family and look at my situation. And I think the turn towards protectionism from both parties in the United States, in Canada as well, and we can talk about the growth and the upswing of the union movement in Canada in especially the last couple of years. I think that there's all linkages to that, and so I think there's a lot of takeaways. And I'm sure we'll unpack your last comment about lessons for progressives here, because I think absolutely, with the federal election coming up in the next 12 months at least, that's going to be a point of discussion.
Hey, can I ask one pointed question to detail? Did Tim Walz help the Harris campaign?
That was the last point I was going to make. Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
Shapiro, they made the wrong choice. If they had gone with Shapiro, would have had a fighting chance to possibly swing Pennsylvania. And I think, was it the reason they lost? No, it's not the only reason they lost, but yeah, big question mark there, right? I think Shapiro could have helped them a lot, and they got tied up in Israel-Gaza politics by choosing Walz instead of Shapiro, and it didn't help them in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people were second guessing that decision even before Harris lost. I actually think I increasingly thought he was a lousy candidate. Look, he's a command sergeant major in the National Guard, which means he rose through the ranks in a difficult job over many years. He was high school teacher and principal. He was a member of the House of Representatives, he's state governor. I think of all those as challenging jobs that require the application of serious talent. And by the end, he was a kind of a hooting buffoon who would show up wherever you pointed him and repeat the same three slogans. And I'm so sick of talking points and slogans and essentially party favors. And I wish I was hoping to see a Vice President, Tim Walz, who would be good at the job because he would understand that it was a serious job. And we're not going to see that guy. And I think in small part because we never saw that guy on the trail.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, think about, like, I don't know if any of you have ever read Neil Postman, Amusing Ourselves to Death.
That's a deep cut. It's been a long time. Yeah.
It's okay, but it's actually worth going back to sometime soon, because the central premise of that is that American society has become purely entertainment based, and that eventually there wouldn't be an outside force that would oppress the United States. It would be internal, because just through the, through sheer entertainment value or spectacle, Americans would be drawn in to a message from an oppressor that seemed, friendly and lovable. Tim Walz, I'm not saying Tim Walz is an oppressor, to be clear. Second thought, Tim Walz, though, was an archetype, right? It was call central casting. What is that, to Garry's point, what is that middle America comfy dude who we can all relate to, high school teacher, look like? Well, he looks a lot like Tim Walz. Was he actually the right person for the job? I question it completely, as I think Garry and you've alluded to, Paul. But in some respects, these campaigns have become all about who looks the part.
Yeah.
Who looks the part, not who can do the job.
Yeah.
I think to add on that, if I may, like one thing we haven't touched on is the state of democracy and protecting our democratic institutions. And I think, this is the social media president. He works well with the truth-spurning social media, and his message is short. It is a message about resentment, nationalism, protection. It's a great place to spread disinformation and challenge the electoral norms of the United States. It's also the easiest way to reach a lot of people with an extremely addictive form of social media on your phone that gets into your brain. You're checking it constantly. You only get little tiny sound bites. And you think about the decline of traditional media, and there are huge swaths of rural areas who have no media that's traditional whatsoever. They just have this, and it's right in their brain. I think it's an important message for us in Canada to start really investing in our own democratic institutions and protecting our democracy. I feel like it's been a bit of an abstract thing, sometimes a cute thing that Heritage is working on here and there, but like it's serious now. It's serious. And that has a huge role to play as well. And it goes back to the need for quick entertainment and the ability to capture emotion through social media, as opposed to, people aren't going on social media to get messages of hope and change and joy. They're going on there because they're alienated, and they're attaching themselves to a message that works with them without a lot of explanation.
Okay.
The surefire way to increase distrust in whether it's social media or whatever is have the government control it or government fund it or government do things to reduce disinformation. That is bound for failure. And we can talk about media subsidies in this country, but that has not been successful in any way, shape, or form. And I think you can bet your bottom dollar that under a new government, those media subsidies are toast.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. And I also am not here to beat on the media platforms either. They're going to be the problem and the solution. And so, it behooves everyone to work in partnership here. I just think let's get a little bit serious about solutions.
Now, let me put you back in your partisan roles and send you into a briefing with the leaders of your party this morning. What are you telling them about what this Trump victory means and what they should do next? Marci, in you go to the Prime Minister's office. What are you going to tell the Prime Minister?
Oh, this is feeling very familiar. Okay, so quite a few things. And I actually think, for all of us, we're all students and observers of American politics, but practitioners of Canadian politics. And so I think there's real value in trying to do this unpack in the Canadian context and how people react. A few things I'll say off the top. I actually believe that regardless of whether I was going in to brief Prime Minister Trudeau or if I was going in to brief Mr. Poilievre at this particular moment, some of the brief would be identical. First things first is anyone who is in the practice of politics in this country, particularly as we move into an election year, which 2025 will be, you have to internally do a full case study postmortem on what we've just experienced. It is not good enough. It is not good enough to just skim the top and think that you know what happened, even though, in the last few minutes we skimmed the top and talked about a few of the key indicators, which is useful. Everybody actually has to do a real deep dive and understand where they stand vis-a-vis what just happened, because there is no better proxy. There are so many differences, but there is also no better case study for what we are about to experience in our federal politics than what just happened. And so if I'm going in to see the PM this morning, we're on a few tracks. The first track is, from a party perspective, we are doing a deep dive. We are looking at everything the Democrats did right and everything they did wrong, from candidate selection to narrative to GOTV. All of it should be on the table. All of it needs to be examined. There is a natural relationship between the Liberal Party of Canada and Democratic strategists. So this is, bound to happen, but it cannot happen again in a cursory way. It has to happen in a really deep and meaningful way between, now and, well, let's say you don't have a lot of time, but you have to take the time between now and Christmas at minimum to really examine that. And all of the road testing that the Liberals have been doing, using some of the narrative, adopting some of the narrative we've seen from the States, we won't go back. Does that hold now? I mean, they've been using it, but you really now have to question everything. Is that actually a good line for us? Because I think it's probably tarnished at this point. So there's a real, you have to look in the mirror and actually say, what did they do? What did we think they were doing that we liked? What are we now going to do differently? And start to build from that. And I would imagine Andrew Bevan's probably working on that as we speak, but that would be job one. The concurrent tracks for the government, of course, because you're still governing, you're governing now in a lame duck period, and then you have to plan for what comes next, is absolutely taking a look at the bench and asking yourself, do I have the right bench in place to be interlocutor with what is coming in as an administration? The Trudeau government did this in 2016 as well, and they did make pretty significant changes, including to the foreign minister at that time. So you've got to ask some pretty tough questions now that I think you probably hoped you didn't have to ask. But now you do have to ask, is this the team that is going to go toe-to-toe with what's coming in? Do they have the experience? Do they have the grit, the tenacity to be really tough? Because guess what? It's going to be really tough. It's not going to be business as usual. So you need people with real intestinal fortitude, as well as some savvy around how to strategize and how to deal with what's incoming. You need to take a look at that maple charm strategy and offensive. And this is actually what I think holds true for both parties. I do think there are bedrocks of that Team Canada strategy, regardless of whether you're Liberal or Conservative or NDP, that actually do matter. Canada, vis-a-vis the United States, in my view, is unquestionably stronger when we come together and recognize that these issues are so existential from an economic perspective, a security perspective for Canada, that they need to, in some respects, be transcendent of partisan politics. And what the Trudeau government did to some good success, and I would encourage conservatives to think this through as well, is identify people at that time, as Mr. Mulroney, Mr. Burney, people who actually understood the ethos of how a Republican administration, and I recognize MAGA Republicanism is not traditional Republicanism, but what is the headspace of who we are going to be dealing with? What is that mindset? Bring those people in and keep them close. And recognize that you are going to have to work across party lines. Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Poilievre may have to work across party lines. Provincial leaders, provincial and territorial leaders have huge vested stake and interest in what is coming next. Bring them back together. It's actually a moment where I think whichever party leader can demonstrate that they get that this is bigger than our party politics and can bring people together, I think actually can bring Canadians from a centrist perspective together to coalesce around this concept that we are going to be better together. And I don't mean to sound like all Aaron Sorkin last, West Wing Canada North style here in terms of kumbaya, but it is true. What we are now facing is so consequential that a lot of our internal politics becomes inconsequential overnight as you lead into the swearing in of the new administration. So that's what I would be briefing the boss to be thinking about.
God, Marci, is that all you got? Thank you. That was fantastic. That, I think, just illustrated why when I thought I should get a panel together, the first thing I thought to myself was, I wonder if I can get Marci Surkes. So thank you. Garry, across the street at the OLO, what are you saying to Pierre Poilievre this morning?
Yeah, and I
hypothetically,
think
I want to emphasize
hypothetically,
yes.
Of course. Hypothetically, of course. Look, one of the benefits of being in opposition and you're, months away from a federal election is you have time to calibrate very quietly behind closed doors. You're not in the limelight of ministers having to make decisions on the here and now about certain policies. You're developing and you're polishing and you're finessing your policy platform in advance of the next election. And it allows you to say, okay, let's first of all pick through the entrails, a little bit of what Marci's saying, and saying like, look, not just the presidential result. It's a little bit different, obviously, for what Marci said, because those ties between Democratic strategists and the Liberal Party of Canada, they're simply not there on the Republican Party versus and the Conservative Party, the infrastructure. Look, there are relationships between people, members of parliament and senators and congressmen and women that have existed for a long time, but it is not institutional in the same way, a lot of way it is with the Liberal Party and the Democratic Party. So, first of all, I think you're saying, okay, what is in our platform draft that, is a threat to the relationship? Let's jettison anything that is a possible threat. Let's look at it through that lens. Secondly, I think you are actively going to be seeking out who in our caucus and in our wider community has good relationships, not just with people in the former Trump administration or that nexus, but incoming new senators. The Senate has flipped to the Republicans. There are new senators coming in. More likely than not, there is somebody that has a relationship with somebody. We talked about Jamil Javani being the new candidate. All of a sudden, people were kind of when he was
JD
first
Vance's
elected.
former roommate.
JD Vance's former roommate. You don't think that if Mr. Poilievre forms government that he will try to play that whisper role? Of course he will. So in some ways, that is a huge boon for the Conservatives to have that personal relationship that exists. And we know, going back to Brian Mulroney, what he said about the Canada-U.S. relationship, it's a lot about personal relationships. So if that can be a benefit to us, you're talking to Jamil Javani and saying, how do we work through this next period quietly behind closed doors, those sorts of things. And then you're looking at the House results too. Who has those relationships? So I think that's what you're doing from a structural point of view. On the big policy front, you've got some big questions to ask about. First of all, about supply management and agricultural sector. That is a massive, massive question as you're developing your policy suite. How do we deal with this with incoming Trump administration? Can we get a deal on softwood lumber? Look, if we say we're going to go to 2% on NATO, can we get a deal on softwood lumber, say, in the first 100 days of a new government? I think there might be some discussions there that could take place. So you're looking at those sorts of things. But you're going to have that real structural discussion behind closed doors on the 2% commitment. I was Washington not that long ago, and everyone said, doesn't matter who wins, just make the commitment, because especially if Trump wins, like, he's going to be saying, where's the 2%, Canada, right? So you have those discussions. And I think border security and climate policy, does Trump keep the IRA, like our suite of investment tax credits and all these other things that currently exist? I think you step back and take a look at and compare to what Trump has said and say, if we take government in a year from now, are we going to be faced for those things? Finally, I'll just say, in terms of that Team Canada approach that Marci talks about, look, I think it was effective in the past. I have my doubts whether or not the political climate currently in Canada would allow for that. And I think that's a live question. And I think it's a question Mr. Poilievre may have to answer about that. Will you participate if there is a Team Canada approach? And that question may come sooner rather than later.
Am I correct in recollecting that Andrew Scheer, as Conservative leader, did some of this outreach as part of? Well, they weren't calling it Team Canada. They're calling it what's that excellent term you use, Marci?
A maple charm offensive.
Yes. Did Andrew Scheer do some maple charm? Or am I just out to lunch?
I don't think that was part of it, but there are current members of the Conservative caucus that have excellent relationships across the aisle, both sides. I think of somebody like Randy Hoback, who, a former parliamentary secretary, chair of the Trade Committee. He has excellent relationships in Congress and is very nuanced at understanding the threats that are coming at us. I think somebody like that is probably going to, be meeting with Mr. Poilievre and his team sooner rather than later to unpack all of this.
I know that Brad Wall and Rona Ambrose did go down into the States at the request of the Liberal government while Trump was president to do some of this laying on of the charm. And
on the flip side, Brian Mulroney and Derek Burney, when they briefed the Liberal cabinet on their discussions with the incoming administration, immediately after that meeting, and with the full knowledge of the PMO, they came across the aisle and they briefed Rona Ambrose and myself on what they had discussed and what they had heard. And so it was actually very beneficial to hear that right from Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Burney's mouth.
Huh. Okay. Allison, Gifford, a little rusty. Been a while since you briefed the NDP leader, but in you go. What are you going to tell Jagmeet Singh?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will, start with a disclaimer that, yeah, I work for the NDP, but I've also been a trade lobbyist and a tech lobbyist. So I'm trying to sort of balance the two in my head. But I would say, like, further to what Marci said earlier about us seeing this movie before, I think it's a question if the sequel's like Terminator 2 or Sex and the City 2. Because like Terminator 2 would be a great sequel, but I feel like we're going in the Sex and the City 2 direction here. And I feel that way because I heard the Liberal talking points last night about Team Canada getting dusted off and getting the band back together, but it's not the same situation. I mean, in the United States, Trump knows the levers of government now. He has gotten rid of most of his opponents, and he's gotten a lot of proponents in the Supreme Court. So he's coming in knowing how to play the game and do more damage now. But on our side, this isn't Camelot anymore. When we had Team Canada at the beginning, this was like the beginning of a very popular leader's mandate with a lot of goodwill, a lot of celebrity status. We don't see that right now. If anything, I would say there's so much political gamesmanship domestically at the moment that it doesn't make us look good to our trading partner. I would say, okay, if I put my trade hat on, I would say, let's not talk about, mandating any discussions of supply management. There's some bad trade behavior on digital policy as well with the DST and C11. These are all things that I think would have caught the ire of the United States if they had the ability to really pay attention to what we're up to. It's going to become pretty exposed in the next little while. So it might be a little bit more important to focus on our nation as a whole and not on just these domestic politics. And I think the same could be said for what we saw with foreign interference as well. So, none of these files may be like, cornerstone to Jagmeet Singh's platform. But that said, dude, you're the only one who wasn't doing this. And you're probably the most likable of all leaders now. So for me, I would think there might be a role as bridge builder, because the other challenge here is that part of our industrial policy challenges, part of our productivity challenges is our relationship with the provinces. And so maybe Jagmeet here can start doing some very meaningful work with Manitoba, with BC. You may have more burgeoning governments up and coming. I don't know, but I could see a bit of an elder states role there, even though he's young. Just being the guy who isn't doing these silly things and putting Canadians first. So I think that might be a good place for him to walk into. I think he's got to keep focusing on pocketbook issues, which resonate. Maybe start positioning clean energy as an opportunity. If we're losing the IRA subsidies, or there are less IRA subsidies on the US side, this may also present opportunity for clean energy here. And that's another sector that really needs leadership right now. And then finally, I think, go back to focusing on those democratic institutions. He's a modern young leader who is also, probably the most savvy with social media. Start getting that message out. Start getting that message out to different communities. I think there is opportunity for him to continue defining himself. I mean, one of the things I said on the last podcast is, I think everybody likes Jagmeet Singh, but they just don't know him. He's got to get out there more and maybe just get a little outside of the traditional bread and butter NDP issues. Get in Brian Massey. He's got great things to say about the border. He's got great things to say about trade. And I think to your point, Garry, we all know in Ottawa how strong Randy Hoback is, working with Brian Massey, used to be working with Wayne Easter. Those people are incredibly important to this relationship with the United States, because they're not, at the end of the day, dyed-in-the-wool partisans. They're not chewing on the furniture. They are incredibly aware and incredibly invested in the relationship. Give all of those guys airtime. And I think the NDP should also give their guy airtime, who has a ton of experience in this area.
Hey, guys, that was a fantastic round. We got a chance to see the expertise that makes you so valuable and so respected in this town. Quick lightning round, or a couple lightning round questions before we go back to the sea of confusion that today represents. It's an open secret that some people around the Prime Minister have been hoping that the US election results could help him get out of the pit that he's been digging himself into in public opinion. Do you see any prospect of that happening? Can he run against Trump and do better than Harris did? Marci.
I'll say this. There's no question in my mind, with the result being as definitive as it was last evening, that the US election result, whether directly or indirectly, has become the ballot box question for 2025 for our federal election. And I actually don't think that's overstating things, because some of what flows from last night's result is going to be directly what people vote on when they get into their polling stations. It is going to be a question of, if there is an imposition of broad-based tariffs across the board, the corollary impacts, the secondary impacts of that on our economy, whether it is going to be this feeling of chaos versus stability. It's hard to say exactly what that frame is going to be right now, because we're not into the election. I think we all hope for at least another couple of months. So it's impossible to say. It's impossible to say that for certain. But there is the only certainty in this wave of chaos is that what happened last night changes everything here. Does it make it easier for Mr. Trudeau? I don't think you can say that. Does it present new opportunities? As actually Allison was just saying, I mean, every crisis is an opportunity. I do think in some respects the election result in the United States is a bit of a crisis point for Canada. Can be managed, but maybe a crisis point. How does Mr. Trudeau seize it? Does he have an opportunity to reinvent himself? Does he have an opportunity to become the statesman, the elder statesman leader, somebody who has been there, done that, done the thing with Trump before, can tangle with him again? I don't think there's any love lost between those two people. So that's going to be difficult. And, just picturing how things ended in Charlevoix last time as we go into a G7 presidency year. There's a funny arc of history there to think through and revisit. Does it potentially give Mr. Trudeau a chance, if the lessons learned from the Harris campaign are well understood and they can pivot appropriately and build a progressive coalition with Mr. Trudeau at the center of it, or even not a progressive coalition, even a centrist coalition with Mr. Trudeau in the middle of it? I think the game has changed. So I would just say, I think he's very much on the board, and maybe in a way that he wasn't with a Harris victory. But there's no question that there's no given here. Like, I don't see last night as necessarily a great thing for Mr. Trudeau at this point, or the Liberal Party at this point, but it keeps them in the game.
Okay. Allison, let me go to you. Did Canadian politics change, or did Canadians just watch American politics changing?
I think the world changed. I mean, I don't know that it's just Canadian politics. I think the change domestically here will be very similar to how people are positioning themselves in terms of, changes in rule-based international trade order, all of those things. But domestic, it would be a lot easier to write talking points this morning. Trudeau's best when he's up against the ropes. We have the experience. We've done this before. Everything's going to be okay. I'd have an easy day if I was his talking point writer. That said, I mean, so much of this business is gut here, and my gut says 10 years, he's done. I don't think that's going to change public opinion on the leader. And secondly, my gut says, and my brain kind of knows, that Poilievre is not Trump. The Conservative Party of Canada is not the Republican Party. I think he knows that. I think his supporters know that. And I would imagine that his team is very ready to position himself that way. So does it really long-term change? My gut says no.
Garry, what do you think? We're at most a year from an election. Does Trudeau have more ammunition than he did?
Well, I mean, first of all, you've had a third of the Liberal caucus out tweeting that Trump and Poilievre are cut from the same cloth. So, there's a reality check there, and to see, Prime Minister's office put out talking.
I'm not on Twitter. Are they saying that today? After he stopped
I don't think they're saying that
victory?
today.
Yeah, okay, good.
I don't think they're saying that today, but they've been saying it for the last 6 months leading up to today.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's the cheapest talking point out there. It's like, everybody we don't like. Doug Ford is Donald Trump. Okay, Doug Ford's not. Danielle Smith is not Donald Trump, right? Like, it's the laziest trope out there, and we've seen some of our friends in the media repeat that. So I do think that there is, especially on the campaign side, some people in the Liberal Party saying, okay, now's our chance to try to make this case. But we need time for that to make its case, which is why I never thought we were going to have an election this fall. I thought that, waiting when you're as far down in the polls as you have been for a year, you need exogenous events to try to change the channel. And this is a huge exogenous event, as Allison said, not just for Canada, but for the world. Big questions about what happens in Ukraine, what happens in Israel, Gaza, all these sorts of things, European trade, all these sorts of things. So in order for things to sink in Canadian mind, I think the plan was always, look, we want to go to October of next year, but if we have to go in the spring, we will. But we need time. Trump doesn't take office until January. If he wins, we need time for that to sink into Canadians' minds. So we'll see how virulent the campaign is, and if we see that pickup again from some of the Liberal caucus on it. But look, to some points made here earlier, Mr. Trudeau likes a good fight. He thinks he's a good fighter, but it seems to be too little, too late. But sure, is it a factor in terms of thinking how we approach the next election, how the Liberals approach their campaign for the next election? Sure. On the flip side, I'd love to see some polling. I haven't seen it recently, but who stacks up better against a Trump presidency? Is it Justin Trudeau or is it Pierre Poilievre? Is it somebody, Mr. Poilievre he's a bit of a street fighter himself, and he's a communications pugilist. Is he willing to take some shots at Donald Trump and to demonstrate his chops? I guess we'll see over the coming days and weeks whether that's the case. But I still think, if they were 8 points down, it'd be a different story. There's between 15 and 22 points in the last polls. Nothing has moved. Canadian polling will be very interesting to see over the next days and weeks to see if this has had any effect whatsoever on how Canadians view their own political leaders.
Hey, I've got so many more questions to ask, but I think I'm just going to save them for later. I really appreciate the conversation we had today. I feel redeemed in my choice of practitioners rather than only comms people to talk about these issues. And I suspect we're going to have a lot more to talk about the next time we meet. Marci Surkes, Allison, Gifford, Garry Keller, thanks for joining me today.